What's up, everybody? So this podcast and show is going to be accompanied by a Substack post, and I know I haven't been up to date on the Substack, but I hope you all give it a look because I feel like there's a lot that's missing from just video or audio content, links for one, but just a slower, more analytical process that comes with writing. And so I want to do a lot more writing, and a lot of these YouTube shows will be accompanied by a Substack. Sometimes they'll just be straight up almost duplications of the Substack. So I hope you guys check that out. It's just simpleheart.org. But I also want to just get in the much more regular habit of producing content that's a little more directed. So many of you have kind of listened to some of the conversations we had over the last year or so since we relaunched this after I got out of jail. And as you know, if you've been listening, the conversations often go in 1,000 different directions, which is a lot of fun. But, for example, the Vegan Gains episode that's labeled, I think, Am I a Scumbag? I didn't go into that conversation thinking that was going to be the subject of the conversation. It ended up being one of our most successful shows, but I didn't think it was going to be on that subject, and it turned into that. And that makes it hard to strategize. And, the reason I'm having this show is not just to have fun and hang out with all of you, although that is part of it for sure, and hang out with the guests, of course, but to actually create change. And to do that, I think we need a little more directed content. And so you're going to see more of these episodes that are just me sort of monologuing with some edits by our team to increase the production quality and make them a little more fun. So if you just listen, by all means, check out the YouTube show, because the YouTube show, and make sure you subscribe to, hit that subscribe button. But the YouTube show will have some nice visual elements to it that you won't get on the podcast alone. But I'm thinking about, what to start 2025 with. I thought the most important subject for me to talk about, and frankly, for all of us to talk about, and for us to discuss and speak about and hear about, and maybe even debate, is reasons for hope. Hope seems like out of fashion right now. Everyone's very cynical. We got the Trump administration coming in that, really won an election on the basis of cynicism and scorn and pessimism. And frankly, I don't know if it matters what your political leanings are. The dominant feeling in the world today is cynicism, or even just kind of a sense of kind of blasé, like, oh, I'm so above it all. I'm so done with things like belief and faith and hope and confidence and optimism, right? All these things seem to have disappeared from the world. And I remain more optimistic and hopeful about the future of the animal rights movement than I've ever felt in my life. And I wanted to explain some reasons why. But I think metaphorically, one of the best ways to show why I'm so hopeful is just to go back to 2018 and outline a situation that probably would have led most people to think, man, you're in a bad place and you must be in a state of despair. And that is when the felony charges came down against me. A felony warrant was issued against me in May 21st, 2018. So to give you some backdrop, I did an investigation at the largest pig farm in the world in 2017, Circle 4 Farms. We rescued 2 piglets from that farm, both of whom were on the brink of death. One of the piglets, Lily, had a very serious leg injury, was hobbling around, was about 1/6 the size of the other piglet. So she was very clearly starving to death. And the other piglet, Lizzie, had all these wounds all over her face. Her face was covered in blood when we took her out. And she was about half the size of the other piglets and was trying to nurse off of a teat, nipple that was completely mutilated. It had been shredded and it looked like a vampire octopus. There was no intact teat, and she's basically drinking her own mother's blood. And for this act of rescue on May 21st, 2018, about a year after the rescue happened, the federal government, after a year of sanctuary raids, intimidation, accusing us of terrorism, finally issued an arrest warrant. And the arrest warrant was for 4 felony charges, 1 misdemeanor. It was categorized as an animal enterprise terrorism investigation and case, and cumulatively could have led me to face up to 60 years in prison, in a Utah prison, with the top line charge being racketeering, a charge that's usually brought against organized crime. It's like conspiracy plus. It's not just conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of conspiracy. There has to be a pattern of conspiracies, and you have to be running this big organization, or at least part of a big organization that's part of a routine pattern of conspiracies. And yeah, very, very serious charges. And you might think, again, this was a low point. You might think that this would make me more cynical about the future of the world. After all, my own government is trying to put me in prison in 60 years. But I wasn't cynical. And I wasn't in despair. In fact, the government was doing exactly what I wanted of them, and it made me even more hopeful about the future. And that wasn't just delusional, for the record, because just 8 days after those felony charges came down in Utah, 500 people, in the face of these charges, walked into another factory farm and rescued 37 hens from the brink of death. So, why was I so hopeful? Why were 500 other people so hopeful in the face of these very serious felony charges? And while I'll talk about specifically why we're hopeful right after the felony charges came down, but really this is a broader question and a broader answer as to why we should be hopeful today. And the first answer is, contrary to what the government thought, they did not control the messaging because we have new forms of technology that were allowing us to get at the actual truth. So the government was accusing me of terrorism. And frankly, for the last few hundred years, really for the past few thousand years, the government has had a monopoly on narrative that when the government says you're a terrorist, you're a terrorist. You go to prison, you shut up, you go to jail, maybe they kill you, and that's it. And that's still the way some countries work. And frankly, it's still the way the United States tries to work. The problem is the massive increase in technological platforms through which someone can get a story out to the world has made it impossible for the government to control the narrative. And we're seeing this around the world, that governments that can try to control the narrative, whether in Canada, Justin Trudeau just stepped down today, the United Kingdom, where you have, Labour and Tories and bouncing back and forth, even communist China. Xi Jinping is one of the most brutal dictators in the world, and he's facing a rising democracy movement that they just can't crush no matter how much they try. And part of the reason is because technology has diversified our information ecosystem and made it more transparent. If you think diversity of thought, diversity of communication increases the odds we'll get at the right answer, this is a reason for hope, right? And I don't want to be naive about this because there's a lot about technology that can also cause problems. And about 20 years ago, just about 20 years ago, one of my mentors in law school at the University of Chicago, Cass Sunstein, wrote this book called, what's it called? Republic.com. That's the name of the book. And I had this thesis about technology back 20 years ago because I was a child of the internet. I grew up on IRC. The only friends I had were internet friends when I was growing up. And they weren't actually real friends, to be honest, which is one of the reasons Republic.com was written, because Republic.com was a book that argued that while technology you might think that technology will increase and just a profusion of perspectives and allow us to get at truth because information will be free. In fact, what it does is allows people to set up little information silos, little echo chambers, where no matter how fringe or extremist your belief is, you're going to go find your crew. And whether it's QAnon or Flat Earth or whatever it is, information profusion, the technological revolution that's occurred over the last 20 years will just allow you to believe whatever crazy things you're believe, and amplify those beliefs, right? So it's the question of the debate between disinformation and information. And I'm not saying this argument is settled entirely, but I think that as people are learning how to use these technologies, and as we're seeing competing technological platforms fight to earn the trust of ordinary people around the world, what we are seeing is humanity as a species, as our civilization, and maybe even the biosphere as a whole, because I think there's weird connections between the biosphere, meaning just all the animals of this earth, and the technology human beings are inventing. I'm not sure we're the only ones in control of it. I mean, an example of this that's a negative would be avian flu. Viruses evolving in the face of human technology and vaccines to become even more deadly. But I think what we're seeing is increasingly grassroots and democratic forces are understanding how to harness technology to get closer to the truth. And that's certainly what happened in 2018 after I was charged with terrorism. So let me just give you a very quick lesson in technology. A lot of people are probably thinking, I don't know how to use all these platforms. I don't know how to do A/B testing or create an analytics dashboard. I see the analytics page on a social media platform and I'm just completely confused. That is all fine and good. You can still use technology to get at truth and make the world a better place if you do something incredibly simple, which is just take a spreadsheet, list out the content you create, or even the content you see that's been most effective, and write it down on a spreadsheet. Make sure you write down stuff that you don't think has been successful too. But if you just have a list, and this is what we started doing in 2012, When I was charged in 2018, for 6 years prior to that, I had been looking, not even at a very deep level because I didn't have time. I mean, in some cases I did some more sophisticated analysis, but typically what we just do is just list out the content and see how it did. And then look at the most successful content and refine our messaging in response to the real world, what the results were. And something happens when you do that. You start getting better at crafting a message. And I think this is true of people around the world who are trying to fight power, who are trying to fight monopolies, who are trying to fight repression, that they're understanding how to use these technological tools. They're refining their practice and their messaging so they can be more effective. And even this YouTube show is an example of that, because when you look, not so much at my work, but if you look globally at what is causing the most political and moral transformation, a lot of it is YouTube. And that's why we started the YouTube show just a few months ago. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I think the profusion of technology is going to prevent those who are currently in power, who are destroying the planet, destroying animals, hurting human beings, the Putins, the Xi Jinpings, and yeah, the Joe Bidens and Donald Trumps too, from maintaining their stranglehold on control on the future of this planet. And that gives me a lot of hope. So the second thing that gives me hope is social networks. One of the most remarkable things about technology is that it allows you to form relationships with people around the world. And it allows new forms of relationship to develop. It's not just about the church, the government, the local political party. There's a profusion of different types of civic organizations and civic connections that can develop. And the reality is, the promise of technology in creating these connections has been mostly a failure. And I'll say more about that in a second, because what we've seen over the last 20 years is that instead of forming civic organization of deep ties and deep roots, the connections that are forming through technology are very ephemeral, meaning they're very momentary. They appear for a moment. They might even feel strong for a moment, and then they disappear. And you saw this with things like the Women's March, right? I think the single largest mobilization in American history after Trump was elected in 2016 happened in 2017. And literally within a few months, the entire thing falls apart. You saw this with Black Lives Matter too, where, again, we have historic mobilization against civil rights violations and police violence in the summer of 2020. And nowadays, no one's talking about racism. Like, everyone's talking about funding the police. Everyone's talking about how much we want to put criminals in prison. And no one's talking about how we have almost 2 million people in jails and cages in the United States. And the vast majority of them are there for reasons that are not valid, whether procedural mistakes made in the prosecution, whether targeting of people of color and people of lower classes, whatever it is. So there's very little conversation about these issues, and partly because the social networks we developed just haven't been very deep or very enduring. But nonetheless, and I'm previewing the big failure, but nonetheless, the real reason for hope and optimism, I'm not doing a very good job of setting out hope and optimism. This is the way my brain works. I'm always leaping ahead to counter arguments before I even finish the argument. But the reason for hope is that when you look around the world about both the number of and the intensity of people who are part of the social network advocating for animals, we're talking about not just traditional vegans. We're talking about, conservatives like Vivek Ramaswamy or Tulsi Gabbard, who is a vegan. We're talking about J.D. Vance's wife and apparently his kids, the vice president of the United States. This will be the first time we'll have a vegetarian in the White House, granted in the vice president's office, but Usha Vance, J.D. Vance's wife, is a vegetarian, apparently cares about animal ethics. And we're talking about people on the left too. There's probably more commentary on animals in 2025, than there's ever been in history. And you're seeing this in social media, you're seeing this in mainstream media, you're seeing this in everyday life. People are talking about animals and they're concerned because no one likes to see animals suffer. And I wrote about this previously. You can see that in my article in Current Affairs. But the fact that Peanut the squirrel, 2 days before the election, was the biggest story in the country is a demonstration of that latent social network. Because what we're finding is in social moments and just in social change, the thing that really drives change is large numbers of ordinary people combining in a network for change. And the reason the Peanut story went so viral, the reason so many of these animal stories are just like being seen by billions of people in some cases, is because there's a latent social network that's ready to be harnessed for change. And that's a reason for hope. Okay. But the third and most important reason, and the third thing the government didn't realize when they charged us back in May of 2018, is faith, and in particular, shared faith. The thing that drives action and change more than anything else is what Doug McAdam, a sociologist at Stanford, calls cognitive liberation. It's a collective belief in our power, in our efficacy, in our faith, in our ability to create some change to the world that needs to happen. And one of the things that the government didn't realize when they charged me in May of 2018, that we showed them on May 29th when 500 of us walked into a factory farm, is that increasingly, not just animal rights activists, but people all over the world believe that we can achieve change. And that's 100% why 500 people walked in with me, despite the fact that all of them could have faced very serious charges. That's why we walked out 37 hens, because we realized we had the power to save these lives. And for those 37 hens, I believe the last of whom that I'm aware of just recently passed away. So we're talking about 7 years later, amazing, beautiful lives that each of these creatures had. For at least those 37 hens, we showed that we had the power to create change. We showed we had the power to rescue them. But what motivated that action was not just the desire to help the dead and dying animals at Sunrise Farms, but a bigger vision, a world where all of the broken creatures of this earth are cared for rather than tormented. We believe in that vision. We still believe in that vision. And that belief is one of the strongest and most powerful reasons I have hope, because I think more and more people have this faith. So you might be asking me, well, isn't meat consumption going up, or at least steady? Are we seeing basically no increases in veganism? Are we seeing factory farms spread to places like China and India? Oh, that's true. But, and this is a very important but, one of the reasons I think that faith has not coalesced in a more powerful fulcrum for change is we don't have the right institutions. And so this is going to be one of my big projects in 2025, trying to create institutions, organizations that can institutionalize this shared faith, this belief that we can create a better world for animals into a way that endures, that in a way that doesn't fall victim to the infighting and the centrifugal forces. Centrifugal force is just a fancy physics term for the law of the universe that pulls things apart over time. Another concept in physics that I've talked about a lot in my Substack, less on the podcast, is this idea of entropy, the idea that disorder increases over time. And there's a natural fraying of faith and social fabric that happens over time unless you can institutionalize, unless you can form some sort of strategy and structure that keeps it all together. And I think one of the great insights for me over the last 10 years is that shared faith that organically can coalesce into very powerful actions, it needs a foundation to tie it all together. And that's going to be one of my big projects for the next year. So what I mean by foundation, I mean probably pre-existing civic organizations. I mean churches, schools, universities, Rotary clubs, bowling clubs. And one of the very promising opportunities that's associated with this failure, because this is a failure, the fact that we had this vision, we had this faith, but it all sort of frayed and fell apart due to entropy and centrifugal forces and all these things that typically cause movements to fall apart, that cause the Women's March to fall apart, that cause Black Lives Matter to fall apart, is that I think there are a lot of promising ideas and hypotheses as to how we can tie it all back together again. And our big project over the next year is going to be to try and harness both existing institutions and these new ideas to tie it together, to make sure that shared faith doesn't fray. So one example of this is Right to Rescue summits. I think, all of you who believe in helping animals, all of you believe in a right to rescue animals from distress, probably feel stronger when you're around other people. And this is just a basic intuition that is obvious if you look at the last 10 years of animal rights history, or frankly, the last couple hundred years of activism history, that when people come together, they're stronger. And so we're going to be doing more Right to Rescue summits, including one that's coming in DC, with incredibly powerful narratives, opportunities to connect with other people who care about animals, in ways to build that shared faith, that shared vision, that give you the tools and resources and power and social support you need to say what you think. And if there's one thing fundamentally that all of us can do to maintain that shared faith, to strengthen that shared faith, it's just say what you think. Don't be afraid to speak your truth. And your truth might not be entirely correct. My truth is entirely correct. But what is absolutely true is we won't get to a more accurate and more powerful collective truth if we silence ourselves. So it is so important that when you go out there and someone says like, oh, you're not bothered if I buy any chicken, are you? That you say, well, to be honest, I am. And here's why. And I bet you would be bothered too. And for us to get at a better shared truth, for us to build a stronger shared faith, we need to have personal faith and truth too. And so it starts with you. So anyways, there's a lot more I could say, but I wanted to start this year with this little episode and invite your thoughts too. And I'm sorry if this is a little all over the place, but just to summarize, I think there are 3 reasons I'm incredibly hopeful for the future of the animal rights movement and veganism. The first is technology, and in particular, the refined use of technology by grassroots movements like the animal rights movement. Second, this increasing social network that goes beyond traditional allies of animal rights, even to the American right, even to MAGA, Vivek Ramaswamy and Tulsi Gabbard. And third, shared faith, this collective vision we have that if we're willing to speak our truth, will come to be. And there's a danger too, which is we don't have a foundation for that shared faith. We don't have that fertile ground to tie that faith together and allow it to endure over time. But the reasons and that I believe we can overcome this, and there are ways that each of us can overcome this. And it starts with first speaking your truth, but second, finding some friends, just connecting with other people. Get out of your house, get off TikTok, get off that video game, come out to a Right to Rescue Summit, or just go to a vegan potluck. You meet other people believe the same things that you believe, or believe different things too. Because part of the way we get to the truth is by having people who disagree come together, bounce ideas off each other, and get to a better thesis for the future. All right. Again, interested in your thoughts, leave a comment. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, rate the podcast or the YouTube show, wherever you're listening to this. And thanks to everyone for your support over last year. I was in jail around this time last year. I'm not this year. And part of the reason for that is all you. So thanks. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.